In 1860, the United States stood at a crossroads. Pause. On paper, it was one nation, one constitution, one flag, one shared past. But beneath the surface, something was tearing it apart. Soft breath, to different visions of America were growing side by side. And neither was willing to give way. In the North, factories roared and railroads spread like veins across the land. In the South, vast plantations depended on forced labor to survive. Pause. Industry versus agriculture. Freedom versus tradition. Lower tone. One country, slowly drifting toward a collision no one could stop. At the center of America's growing crisis was a single question. Pause. A question so powerful, it threatened to destroy the nation itself. Soft inhale. Can one human being truly own another? For decades, the country avoided answering it. But history does not allow silence forever. For the Southern economy, slavery was not just a system, it was survival. For many in the North, it was a moral contradiction that poisoned the idea of liberty. Pause. And for millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Heavy breath. It meant lives lived in chains, without voice, without choice. When compromise finally failed, the nation did not split along foreign lines. Pause. It fractured from within. Families were divided. Friends chose opposing sides. Slow breath. This was not a war against an invader. It was Americans preparing to fight Americans. Men who once trained together, who once pledged loyalty to the same flag, now faced each other across open fields and muddy roads. Pause. Blue against gray. Neighbor against neighbor. Lower. Tense tone. The coming war would test not only armies, but the very meaning of the United States. April 1860-1. Pause. In Charleston Harbor, the tension finally broke. Cannons thundered against Fort Sumter as smoke rose over the water. Soft breath. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. And there would be no turning back. In that moment, the United States crossed a line it could never uncross. Slow, heavy breath. This was no longer a political dispute, it was war. A war that would claim more lives than any conflict America had ever known. Pause. A war that would decide whether the nation would survive or tear itself apart forever. In the mid-19th century, the northern United States was transforming at an astonishing speed. Cities expanded, factories multiplied, and smokestacks rose above crowded streets. This was an America driven by machines, schedules, and constant motion. Progress promised opportunity, but it also demanded long hours, discipline, and sacrifice from those who powered this new industrial world. In the North, time itself became a resource to be controlled. Factory whistles marked the beginning and end of each day. Productivity defined personal worth. The future felt mechanical, loud, and unstoppable. And as the North surged forward, it began pulling the nation toward a direction the South neither trusted nor accepted. Railroads spread across the northern states like iron veins. Goods, people, and information now moved faster than ever before. Distance lost its meaning. Markets expanded beyond imagination. For the North, railroads were more than transportation. They were symbols of unity, economic strength, and national ambition. Every mile of track tightened the North's grip on the country's future. Steel rails carried crops, coal, and manufactured goods, but they also carried influence and power. In the conflict that lay ahead, these railroads would become a decisive advantage, linking armies, cities, and supply lines into a single industrial machine. Inside northern factories, labor followed the relentless rhythm of machines. Men, women, and children worked long hours beneath dim lights and choking air. Freedom existed, but it was measured in wages and exhaustion. Industrial growth delivered prosperity to the nation while quietly extracting its cost from human bodies. This was free labor, but it was far from easy. Workers could leave their jobs, yet poverty often left them with no real choice. The North believed this system, flawed as it was, represented progress. It was a future built on motion, production, and the promise that tomorrow would be better. Far from northern factories, the South moved at a different pace. Life revolved around land, seasons, and inherited tradition. Vast plantations dominated the landscape, shaping society and identity. Change arrived slowly here, and when it did, it was met with suspicion rather than celebration. The Southern economy looked backward instead of forward. Stability mattered more than innovation. Custom mattered more than efficiency. This world was carefully balanced, deeply rooted, and resistant to disruption. But beneath its calm surface rested a system that could not survive without control. Cotton was the lifeblood of the Southern economy. White fields stretched endlessly beneath the sun, feeding global markets and generating immense wealth. Every harvest strengthened the South's position in international trade. Yet cotton demanded labor, and it demanded it relentlessly. That labor came from enslaved people. Their lives powered plantations, ports, and profits. Entire fortunes were built upon their forced work. Without slavery, the plantation system would collapse. And Southern leaders understood this truth with absolute clarity. The Mississippi River served as the South's commercial backbone. Steamboats moved cotton downstream and money upstream. River ports flourished, connecting rural plantations to distant markets. The South was deeply connected to the global economy, but only through the system it refused to abandon. Trade sustained Southern prosperity, but it also reinforced dependence on slavery. Each shipment strengthened economic ties while deepening moral contradictions. Every bale of cotton bound the region more tightly to a system it could neither reform nor release. Politics reflected these two different Americas. In the North, debate filled newspapers, town halls, and public streets. Government was expected to adapt to change. Political conflict was seen as a necessary step toward improvement and reform. In the South, political power rested with landowners and tradition. Authority existed to protect the established order. Any challenge to slavery was treated as an attack on society itself. Change was not a promise, it was a threat. Two labor systems now faced each other within the same nation. One relied on wages and mobility, the other relied on ownership and force. Both claimed to represent prosperity and stability. Both believed the other would eventually destroy the country. These systems could not coexist forever. Each new territory forced a decision. Each decision sharpened divisions. With every expansion westward, the question grew louder and more dangerous, pushing the nation closer to open conflict. On maps, the division became impossible to ignore. Free states clustered in the north. Slave states dominated the south. A single border could determine whether a person lived free or in bondage. Geography had become destiny. Every new state threatened to upset the fragile balance of power. Politics turned into a struggle over land and numbers. Compromise grew weaker with each passing year, and the map itself began to resemble a warning rather than a solution. Northern cities pulsed with energy and ambition. Immigrants arrived daily in search of work and opportunity. Streets overflowed with movement and noise. The North believed the future belonged to growth, expansion, and constant reinvention. Yet progress brought inequality as well as hope. Crowded neighborhoods, dangerous jobs, and social unrest revealed the cost of rapid change. The North was advancing, but beneath its confidence lay tension and uncertainty. In the South, daily life appeared slower and more controlled. Social roles were clearly defined, tradition shaped behavior and identity. On the surface, the system seemed stable and orderly, rooted in generations of custom. But this stability depended on domination. Order required force. As pressure mounted from the outside world, the South grew increasingly defensive. It prepared not for compromise, but for resistance, believing its way of life was under siege. When I look at life under slavery, I see a system designed to erase individuality. Every day followed the same exhausting pattern, dictated by force rather than choice. Enslaved people woke, worked, and rested according to commands, not desire. Their lives were measured not by dreams or ambitions, but by how much labor could be extracted before the sun went down. What strikes me most is how ordinary this cruelty became. Slavery was not chaos, it was routine. It was organized, scheduled, and normalized across the South. This was not a temporary injustice. It was a permanent condition, carefully maintained, quietly defended, and deeply woven into everyday American life. Slavery was not simply tolerated, it was calculated. Plantations, trade networks, and banks all depended on enslaved labor to function. Profit flowed upward, while suffering remained invisible to those who benefited most. When I study this system, it becomes clear that morality was repeatedly sacrificed for economic stability. The economy of the South did not survive despite slavery, it survived because of it. Every argument defending the institution eventually returned to money, production, and survival. The question was never whether slavery was right. It was whether the South could exist without it. A slave auction represents one of the clearest moments where humanity was openly denied. People were examined, priced, and sold in public spaces. Families stood silently as strangers decided their fate. This was not hidden violence, it was a social event, accepted and regulated by law. What is disturbing is not only what happened at these auctions, but how normal they were. Buyers negotiated calmly, sellers recorded transactions. Life continued around them. Slavery did not survive through chaos alone. It survived through paperwork, routine, and public approval. Few things reveal the brutality of slavery more clearly than family separation. Parents watched children taken away without explanation or return. Love offered no protection, marriage carried no legal weight. Under slavery, family existed only as long as it did not interfere with profit. When families were broken apart, the damage extended far beyond that moment. Memory, identity, and trust were shattered. Slavery did not simply control bodies. It dismantled relationships, ensuring that fear and loss remained constant tools of domination. In the North, opposition to slavery grew slowly but steadily. Abolitionists spoke, wrote, and organized despite threats and ridicule. They believed silence made them complicit. To them, slavery was not a Southern problem. It was a national moral failure demanding confrontation. What stands out is how divided the North itself remained. Abolitionists were not universally welcomed. Many were seen as dangerous radicals. Even among those who disliked slavery, few agreed on how far the nation should go to stop it. Printed words became weapons. Newspapers and pamphlets carried stories the South tried to suppress. Testimonies, arguments, and images spread across cities and towns. For the first time, slavery was no longer distant. It entered homes, conversations, and political debates. This flow of information changed the balance of power. Ideas moved faster than laws. Once people began to question slavery openly, it became harder to defend it quietly. Print media turned private doubt into public pressure. The Underground Railroad revealed the human refusal to accept injustice. Ordinary people risked everything to guide enslaved individuals toward freedom. There were no guarantees, only fear and hope moving side by side through darkness. What matters most is not how many escaped, but what the network represented. It proved that slavery could be resisted. Every successful escape challenged the idea that the system was natural, permanent, or uncontested. Slavery relied on constant control. Surveillance, punishment, and intimidation maintained order. Violence was not random, it was structured and intentional. Fear ensured compliance when chains alone were not enough. This system demanded dehumanization on both sides. Enslaved people were denied dignity, while enslavers learned to justify cruelty as necessity. Over time, violence became policy, and policy became tradition. As slavery expanded, politics grew increasingly unstable. Debates in Congress were no longer abstract. Every law, every vote, carried consequences for millions of lives. Compromise delayed conflict, but it never resolved the core issue. The nation argued endlessly over balance and states' rights, but avoided the central truth. Slavery was incompatible with the ideals America claimed to represent. The longer that contradiction remained unresolved, the closer the country moved toward collapse. By the late 1850s, the tension was impossible to contain. Slavery had become more than a moral question, it was a test of national identity. Every event, every decision, pushed the country closer to a breaking point. Looking back, it feels inevitable. A nation cannot be built on freedom while denying it to millions. Slavery was the fuse. The only question left was how long it would burn before the explosion came. When I think about Abraham Lincoln, I do not see a radical revolutionary. I see a cautious man shaped by compromise and doubt. He understood the nation was fragile. Every word he spoke carried weight because he knew one wrong move could push the country beyond repair. Lincoln did not promise to destroy slavery overnight. His strength came from restraint. He believed preserving the Union mattered first. Yet, even this careful position made him terrifying to the South because it suggested change was no longer avoidable. The Lincoln-Douglas debates revealed how deeply divided the country had become. These were not abstract arguments, they were public confrontations over the future of American society. Crowds listened closely, aware that the stakes were far greater than a single election. What stands out is Lincoln's careful logic. He challenged slavery without promising immediate destruction. Douglas defended local control. Both men spoke to fear. One warned of moral collapse. The other warned of national chaos. The election of 1860 was unlike anything before it. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. That fact alone shattered the illusion of unity. For the first time, a president was elected without the consent of an entire region. To the North, the election felt constitutional and legitimate. To the South, it felt like exclusion. Power had shifted. And once power moves, fear follows close behind. In the South, Lincoln's victory was interpreted as a direct threat. Newspapers warned that slavery was doomed. Conversations turned from debate to survival. Many believed remaining in the Union meant surrendering their way of life. What matters is how quickly fear replaced patience. Lincoln had not taken office. No laws had changed, yet trust was already gone. The election itself became proof that the system no longer protected Southern interests. Secession conventions transformed anxiety into action. Delegates gathered, debated, and voted to leave the Union. These decisions were framed as defensive, not aggressive. Leaders claimed separation was the only path to safety. What is striking is the confidence behind these choices. Many believed secession would be peaceful. They assumed the North would not fight. It was a miscalculation that history would soon expose. As states withdrew, the map of the United States began to fracture. Lines that once represented political boundaries now marked loyalty and resistance. Geography turned into ideology. Each state that left made compromise harder. The visual reality of division forced the nation to confront what words had long avoided. The Union was unraveling in plain sight. The Confederate States of America emerged quickly, almost methodically. A government was formed, leaders were chosen, and a constitution was written. This was not chaos, it was organized separation. By creating a new nation, the South crossed a psychological threshold. Returning to the Union would now require surrender, not negotiation. The distance between the two sides widened dramatically. Lincoln's inauguration took place under an atmosphere of fear. Soldiers guarded the ceremony. The Capitol itself felt uncertain. His speech reflected restraint rather than triumph. Lincoln appealed to shared history and reason. He offered peace, not punishment. Yet his words could not undo months of distrust. The country was already moving beyond persuasion. Washington became a city on edge, rumors of plots and violence circulated constantly. The federal government prepared for the possibility that its own citizens might soon turn against it. This tension revealed a deeper truth: authority without loyalty is fragile. The Union still existed on paper, but emotionally, it was already fractured. Fort Sumter stood as a symbol of unresolved authority. A federal fort surrounded by Confederate territory, it represented the question no one wanted to answer directly: who truly controlled the nation? Every day the fort remained supplied felt like provocation. Every delay increased pressure. Eventually, silence itself became impossible to maintain. When the first shots were fired, they were not sudden. They were the result of years of fear, compromise, and denial. The war did not begin in a moment, it culminated there. At the start, many believed the war would be brief. Young men volunteered with confidence, driven by duty, pride, and expectation. Few understood what prolonged conflict demanded. The uniforms were new, the faces untested, and the future still imagined as something controllable. What strikes me is the innocence of that moment. Training camps felt almost ceremonial. Songs were sung, flags were raised, and promises were made. War, at this stage, remained an idea rather than a lived reality. The contrast between Union blue and Confederate gray soon defined identity. Clothing became allegiance. On the battlefield, these colors separated neighbors and former friends. What once unified now divided with visible clarity. Uniforms carried meaning beyond fabric. They represented belief systems, loyalties, and fear. Once worn, they made turning back emotionally impossible, even when doubt quietly emerged. Bull Run shattered expectations. The battlefield revealed confusion rather than glory. Commands failed, lines broke, and courage met disorder. The war introduced itself not with honor, but with chaos. Observers who came to watch a spectacle fled in panic. That retreat symbolized something deeper. The nation realized it had underestimated itself, and the cost would be far greater than imagined. Civil War combat rarely followed clean plans. Smoke blurred vision, noise erased commands, and fear replaced clarity. Soldiers often fired without seeing their enemy, guided more by instinct than strategy. In that confusion, bravery and panic looked almost identical, and survival depended as much on luck as on discipline. What strikes me is how little control anyone truly had once fighting began. Officers shouted orders that vanished into chaos. Flags became fragile points of orientation. War revealed itself not as calculated movement, but as uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. Marching defined daily life more than battle itself. Endless roads, aching bodies, and constant hunger wore soldiers down slowly. The war tested endurance long before it tested courage, turning exhaustion into a silent enemy that never stopped advancing. During these marches, reflection became unavoidable. With each step, soldiers wondered how far loyalty could stretch before it broke. The distance between home and battlefield was measured not only in miles, but in emotional separation. Confederate camps revealed the quiet reality behind grand political promises. Supplies were limited, uniforms worn thin, and food often uncertain. Soldiers learned to adapt not out of strength, but necessity. What held these camps together was not comfort or efficiency, but shared belief. Many convinced themselves that endurance alone could justify sacrifice, even as hardship steadily eroded body and spirit. What stands out is how morale survived in fragile conditions. Scarcity forced cooperation, and suffering became a form of validation. Retreat felt impossible, because leaving would mean admitting that loss had no meaning. In these camps, resilience was less a choice than a psychological defense against despair. Union camps were better supplied, yet unease lingered constantly. Waiting filled the hours between battles, allowing doubt to grow quietly. Soldiers cleaned weapons, repeated routines, and tried to impose order on uncertainty. War, in these moments, felt less like action and more like prolonged anticipation. These pauses mattered deeply. Fear often arrived before combat, not during it. Silence created space for imagination, and imagination rarely offered comfort. The mind wandered to home, to consequences, to questions with no clear answers. The deepest wound of this war lay in divided families. Brothers stood on opposite sides, shaped by the same past yet pulled apart by belief. Uniforms transformed kinship into opposition, turning political disagreement into personal tragedy. This fracture went beyond the battlefield. Victory could not erase memory, and survival did not guarantee reconciliation. The war reshaped identity itself, forcing Americans to redefine loyalty, even within their own homes. Ivilians experienced the war as an unchosen burden that settled into daily life. Armies passed through towns, taking food, animals, and certainty with them. Families learned to live with interruption, never knowing which flag would appear next. What strikes me is how endurance replaced normalcy, as ordinary people adapted to instability without recognition or reward. Their suffering rarely entered official histories, yet it reshaped the nation quietly. Displacement changed how people understood safety and trust. Homes stopped feeling permanent. In this way, the war reached far beyond battlefields, altering civilian identity and memory, leaving scars that statistics and reports could never fully capture. Medical tents revealed the harsh limits of 19th century medicine. Doctors worked under constant pressure, surrounded by wounded men and scarce supplies. Decisions had to be immediate, often based on experience rather than certainty. What stays with me is how healing became an act of triage, where saving one life often meant accepting the loss of another. Beyond the physical wounds lay a quieter burden. Surgeons and nurses carried the weight of choices that could not be undone. Each decision lingered long after the tent was quiet again. The war tested not only bodies, but conscience, forcing those who healed to endure memories as lasting as any injury. Letters from the front became fragile bridges between two separate worlds. Soldiers chose their words carefully, describing enough to remain honest, yet withholding enough to protect those at home. Ink carried fear, hope, and restraint at once. What feels most human is how these messages tried to preserve normal life, even as war steadily erased it. For families, each letter was reassurance and anxiety combined. Silence between messages felt heavier than bad news. These exchanges remind me that war is not only fought with weapons, but with waiting. Through written words, people struggled to remain connected to identities that the battlefield constantly threatened to dissolve. Burials during the war became frequent and painfully efficient. There was rarely time for ceremony or reflection. Bodies were laid to rest quickly, often without names, as the fighting moved on. What weighs heaviest is how loss became routine, yet never truly familiar, forcing soldiers to accept grief as part of daily survival. Each grave marked more than a fallen soldier. It represented a future cut short and a family permanently changed. Standing among these graves, one senses how the war measured its progress not only in territory, but in absence. Death did not end participation in the conflict, it expanded its reach. As the conflict expanded, the war revealed its true scale. Armies grew larger, supply lines stretched farther, and battles consumed entire regions. Individual stories were slowly absorbed into numbers and maps. What becomes clear is how scale changes perception, making loss feel distant even as it multiplies, and turning strategy into an exercise of endurance rather than inspiration. With this expansion, the war stopped feeling temporary. It became a system that demanded constant input of lives, labor, and resources. The nation adjusted its expectations, accepting that victory would not come from a single decisive moment, but from the slow accumulation of pressure and sacrifice over time. Attrition reshaped how the war was understood. Battles no longer promised resolution, only continuation. Progress was measured in persistence rather than breakthrough. What stands out is how survival itself became a form of resistance, as soldiers learned that simply holding position required as much strength as advancing. This slow erosion tested belief more deeply than sudden defeat. Hope did not disappear, but it changed shape. Soldiers fought less for victory and more because stopping felt impossible. In this phase, the war consumed not only resources, but conviction, demanding endurance long after enthusiasm had faded. By this stage, the illusion of a quick victory had completely vanished. Commanders and soldiers alike understood that the war demanded total commitment, not bold gestures. Every decision carried long consequences. What feels most striking is the quiet acceptance that this conflict would shape a generation, consuming time, lives, and certainty with no clear endpoint in sight. The nation continued forward not with confidence, but with obligation. Turning back was no longer imaginable because too much had already been lost. The war became something endured rather than chosen. In that realization, America crossed a threshold, accepting that survival itself now depended on seeing the struggle through, regardless of the cost. In late 1862, Lincoln carried the war into quiet rooms far from the battlefield. Alone at his desk, he weighed a decision that could redefine the nation's purpose. This was not only a military calculation, but a moral reckoning. What strikes me is how leadership, at this moment, meant choosing uncertainty over delay, knowing that inaction now carried its own irreversible cost. Lincoln understood that timing mattered as much as intent. Acting too early risked fracture within the Union. Acting too late risked losing meaning altogether. The silence of the White House masked the pressure of history closing in. In this space, the war shifted from preserving a nation to questioning what that nation stood for. Inside the cabinet room, debate reflected the tension of the entire nation. Advisors weighed political risk against moral responsibility, aware that no decision would leave the Union unchanged. What feels most human here is the hesitation. These men understood that issuing the proclamation could strengthen the war effort, yet also deepen division at a moment when unity was already fragile. Lincoln listened more than he spoke. He allowed doubt to surface, not as weakness, but as recognition of consequence. The discussion was not about ideals alone, but about survival. In that room, the war's direction quietly shifted, as leadership accepted that neutrality towards slavery was no longer possible without undermining the purpose of the fight itself. Maps spread across the table told a sobering story. Lines shifted slowly, victories felt costly, and stalemate threatened morale. Strategy now required more than troop movement. What stands out is how military reality shaped moral choice. Without progress on the battlefield, political courage risked collapse. The war demanded a moment that could redefine purpose and restore momentum. Voice 3.2. Studying these maps, leaders saw limits clearly. Territory could be gained and lost, but meaning could not. The Emancipation Proclamation began to appear not as a separate act, but as a strategic necessity. By changing what the war represented, Lincoln sought to change how it would be fought and how history would remember its sacrifices. Antietam unfolded with a level of violence the nation had never witnessed before. The battlefield became crowded with confusion, courage, and loss compressed into a single day. What strikes me is how this battle felt less like a victory and more like a warning. It showed the cost of continuation, making clear that the war could no longer be treated as a limited struggle. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam carried enormous weight. It halted Confederate momentum and gave the Union something it desperately needed: legitimacy to act. In the aftermath, the question was no longer whether the war would continue, but what it would now be fought for. From this moment, moral purpose and military necessity began to move together. After Antietam, the battlefield fell silent, but its meaning lingered heavily. The ground was marked by loss on a scale that demanded acknowledgement. What stays with me is how the stillness forced reflection. Victory felt hollow, yet unavoidable. The nation confronted the reality that continuing without change would only multiply suffering without purpose. This aftermath created a narrow opening in history. Lincoln understood that moral action required context, and context had now been provided by sacrifice. The cost had been paid in blood. In that understanding, the war crossed a threshold where an action became more dangerous than decision, and hesitation risked betraying those already lost. In the days that followed, Lincoln reached the point where delay no longer felt responsible. The weight of Antietam pressed on every thought. What feels striking is how decision here was not driven by confidence, but by clarity. He understood that history rarely offers clean choices. It offers moments where refusing to act becomes its own form of failure. This decision was not framed as triumph, but as necessity. Lincoln knew the proclamation would provoke resistance, even within the Union, yet he also recognized that the war had already transformed beyond its original intent. By choosing to act, he accepted that leadership meant guiding the nation through discomfort toward a future still uncertain but no longer directionless. As the proclamation took shape on paper, each word carried consequences far beyond ink. This was not a speech meant to inspire instantly, but a document designed to endure scrutiny. What I sense here is restraint. Lincoln chose language carefully, aware that emotion could weaken legitimacy. Precision became a form of protection, guarding the decision against misinterpretation and future reversal. Writing this document required distancing feeling from form. The suffering of millions stood behind the text, yet the tone remained measured, almost austere. That contrast reveals something profound about change. Lasting transformation often arrives quietly, framed in legal terms, rather than dramatic gestures. In this moment, liberation began as carefully structured resolve. When the proclamation became public, reactions across the North were far from unified. Some welcomed it as a long overdue moral stand, while others feared it would prolong the war. What feels important is this uncertainty. Even righteous decisions can unsettle those they aim to lead. Change, especially of this scale, rarely arrives with universal comfort. Newspapers reflected a divided public mind. Support mixed with anxiety, hope with apprehension, Many understood the ethical weight, yet worried about consequences on the battlefield and at home. This moment reminds me that progress often advances through disagreement. The proclamation did not resolve tension, but it clarified direction, forcing the nation to confront what it was willing to endure for its ideals. In the South, the proclamation was received with anger and defiance. Leaders saw it as a direct threat to their social order and economy. What feels most striking is how a single document could provoke fear across an entire region. The words on paper ignited not only political resistance, but deep personal anxieties about identity and future. Every newspaper, every public meeting reflected tension and disbelief. For many, this was not abstract policy, it was a declaration that life as they knew it was under challenge. The reaction highlights how transformative decisions often meet opposition, revealing that moral necessity can be inseparable from social upheaval. For enslaved people, hearing about the proclamation brought a mixture of hope, disbelief, and cautious optimism. The news promised freedom, yet the reality of war made it fragile. What feels profound is how this announcement transformed perception of possibility. Suddenly, what had been unimaginable became conceivable, altering hearts and minds even before action reached them. In plantations and settlements, whispers spread quickly. Families contemplated new futures while remaining aware of present dangers. The proclamation did not instantly change circumstances, but it ignited agency and courage. This moment shows that liberation begins first in consciousness before it can manifest fully in daily life. African American men stepping forward to enlist embodied a profound shift in the war's meaning. What had been a conflict over union became a fight for freedom and recognition. Enlistment required courage beyond the battlefield, facing prejudice, danger, and uncertainty. Each uniform represented both personal resolve and collective aspiration for justice. The act of joining the Union Army was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated that emancipation was not merely a document, but a call to action. Soldiers carried hope and fear together, reshaping the identity of the Army itself. In these moments, the war's purpose expanded from survival of the nation to affirmation of human dignity. With the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War began to shift from a political conflict to a moral struggle. Soldiers and citizens alike confronted questions of justice, equality, and human rights. What stands out is how purpose deepened, transforming motivation from mere survival of the Union to a fight with ethical stakes that would define the nation's conscience for generations. This turning point demanded reflection from all sides. Victory was no longer just territorial or strategic, it was ethical. Each decision on the battlefield carried moral weight. The war's meaning expanded, intertwining action with principle, reminding us that history often advances through recognition of what is right rather than what is easy. Across the Atlantic, observers watched the proclamation with cautious interest. European nations debated the implications for diplomacy, trade, and morality. What strikes me is how a domestic policy reverberated globally, reminding the United States that moral decisions carry international consequences and that leadership is always observed beyond one's own borders. Newspapers and diplomats dissected each line, interpreting intention and potential outcomes. The war was no longer only a domestic struggle. It had become a stage for the world to judge America's values. In this moment, moral choice and global perception intertwined, showing that acts of conscience can reshape reputation as much as policy. The proclamation, combined with strategic victories, marked a true turning point in the war. Soldiers sensed that the fight had acquired new meaning, no longer only about territory, but about freedom and justice. What feels profound is how purpose reshaped morale. Each advance carried the weight of ethical commitment alongside military necessity. This moment altered perception on both sides. The Union now fought with renewed determination, while the Confederacy faced the growing realization that the war was no longer simply political. The battlefield became an arena where ideals were as crucial as tactics, reminding us that the course of history often shifts when moral clarity meets opportunity. After the proclamation, Union soldiers advanced with a sense of purpose that extended beyond orders. Each step carried the weight of a moral mission, blending courage with conscience. What feels striking is how awareness of a just cause altered action, transforming ordinary military movement into an expression of national and human aspiration. For these soldiers, fighting became more than strategy, it became affirmation. The war's meaning had expanded, and with it, the stakes of every engagement. The commitment to liberty infused effort with determination, reminding us that moral conviction can elevate duty into something profoundly transformative. Union soldiers marched into Richmond with cautious triumph. The city's streets carried the echoes of defeat, fear, and relief all at once. What strikes me is how victory felt intertwined with devastation. The Confederacy's capital was in Union hands, yet the war's toll remained palpable, visible in the rubble and the wary eyes of citizens witnessing history unfold. This entrance was more than a military advance. It was a passage from conflict to consequence. Soldiers moved through streets heavy with memory and loss. Each step reminded them that liberation and destruction often arrive together. Triumph carried gravity, as the cost of securing the nation's unity had been written in both courage and sorrow. At Appomattox Courthouse, Confederate leaders laid down their arms, ending formal hostilities. What feels most profound is the mixture of relief and resignation in that moment. Surrender was not just a military event. It was a recognition of a nation's fracture, a reluctant acceptance of change, and the beginning of a painful path toward reconciliation. The symbolism of surrender weighed heavily on both sides. Officers and soldiers confronted the consequences of prolonged conflict, seeing firsthand the human and material cost. This act marked the close of one chapter, yet hinted at the challenges ahead. Unity would require more than ceremony. It demanded enduring reflection and collective responsibility. Lincoln walked among the remnants of battle, observing silence where violence had reigned. What strikes me is his quiet contemplation, as if the ground itself carried lessons no briefing could convey. Each crater, each scar on the landscape reminded him that the price of unity was measured in human lives and shattered communities. This visit was not ceremonial, it was intimate and sobering. The president absorbed the consequences of policy made distant from the front lines. Reflection here bridged command and consequence, revealing that leadership demands witnessing suffering firsthand to truly comprehend the cost of decisions. As Reconstruction efforts began, Northern officials and local communities faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a nation. Streets, schools, and governance needed repair, yet underlying tensions persisted. What feels striking is how physical reconstruction mirrored social reconstruction, revealing that restoring structures was inseparable from restoring trust and civic cohesion. These early efforts were tentative and fragile. Every meeting and project carried the weight of uncertainty and hope. Leaders and citizens alike understood that success required patience, compromise, and moral commitment. Rebuilding the nation demanded more than labor. It demanded recognition of past divisions and a willingness to confront them honestly. Freed African Americans began to shape new lives amidst uncertainty and hope. Schools, farms, and communities slowly took root, reflecting resilience and aspiration. What feels most profound is how ordinary actions, planting crops, learning to read, forming communities became acts of liberation, each step asserting humanity in a nation long divided. Every effort carried both risk and promise. Freedmen faced lingering prejudice, economic hardship, and social instability, yet persisted. Their determination transformed survival into agency and personal progress into collective progress. In witnessing these small victories, one sees how freedom's value is measured not in proclamations alone, but in lived, tangible effort. Across the South, towns and farms bore the scars of prolonged conflict. Buildings lay in ruins, fields were abandoned, and daily life had been upended. What strikes me is how the war's cost was visible in every structure and every empty street, reminding all that the path to unity required confronting both material and human devastation. Civilians surveyed what remained of homes and livelihoods, balancing despair with the need to rebuild. Recovery would demand more than effort. It required resilience, cooperation, and vision. The nation's wounds were not only on battlefields, but etched into communities that would carry memory and responsibility for generations. Graves and memorials emerged across the landscape, honoring those lost in the conflict. Each marker told a story of sacrifice, absence, and enduring grief. What feels most poignant is how memory became both personal and collective, a way for the nation to acknowledge cost while grappling with the enormity of loss that had shaped its present. Families and communities gathered to remember, yet the weight of mourning was profound. Monuments and simple markers alike carried lessons of duty, courage, and consequence. These quiet sites remind us that reconciliation and reflection are inseparable from history, and that the cost of unity is measured in human lives as much as in political outcomes. Acts of reconciliation began tentatively, as Northern and Southern leaders sought to bridge a fractured nation. Handshakes and meetings symbolized hope, yet the work required more than ceremony. What stands out is how unity demanded acknowledgement of past wrongs, courage to forgive, and patience to rebuild trust across a divided society. Reconciliation was fragile, often contested, and slow to take root. Every gesture carried historical weight, reminding both sides that lasting peace required moral commitment as much as political agreement. In this process, the nation learned that true unity is earned through deliberate, thoughtful engagement, not imposed by force alone. Lincoln's funeral procession stretched through mourning streets, a nation collectively grappling with grief. What strikes me is how one life came to embody both the cost of the war and the hope of unity. Citizens lined the roads, silent and reflective, aware that his death marked not just a personal loss, but the weight of responsibility for the country's future. Flags flew at half-mast, and the cadence of solemn steps echoed across Washington. The scene reminded all that leadership carries ultimate sacrifice. While the war had ended, the path ahead demanded wisdom and perseverance. Lincoln's passing underscored that rebuilding a nation is both a moral and emotional endeavor, inseparable from the human cost already paid. The nation surveyed the full cost of its internecine conflict, ruined towns, grieving families, and soldiers returning with scars visible and invisible. What feels most profound is how victory and loss intertwined. Unity had been restored, yet it came at a price measured in lives, livelihoods, and the enduring memory of suffering that would shape generations to come. Economic collapse, social upheaval, and human grief lay alongside the triumph of reunification. Rebuilding would demand resilience, empathy, and reflection. The Civil War's conclusion was not an endpoint, but a beginning, reminding us that the journey to a unified nation is inseparable from the weight of history, sacrifice, and moral responsibility. Monuments and memorials rose across the nation, standing as silent witnesses to sacrifice and loss. Each stone carried stories of courage, grief, and remembrance. What strikes me is how memory became tangible, shaping how generations would understand the cost of freedom, reminding citizens that history is both personal and collective. Families and veterans observed these markers with quiet reflection. These memorials were more than tribute. They were tools of education and reconciliation, encouraging dialogue about courage, failure, and resilience. In this way, the war's legacy endured, guiding the nation's understanding of unity and responsibility. Reconstruction-era offices became hubs of cautious optimism and tension. Officials worked to rebuild governance, while freedmen navigated new rights and responsibilities. What feels most striking is how these rooms carried the weight of possibility, balancing hope for progress with the reality of lingering division and resistance from those unready to embrace change. Every document, meeting, and decision in these offices mattered profoundly. Policies were not abstract. They shaped lives, determined futures, and tested the nation's commitment to justice. The work here reminds us that rebuilding society is painstaking and moral as much as it is practical, requiring patience, courage, and reflection. Freed African Americans embraced education and community building as acts of liberation. Schools, gatherings, and local initiatives became expressions of autonomy and resilience. What feels profound is how these simple yet deliberate steps reshaped identity, proving that freedom's meaning extends beyond emancipation to lived opportunity and self-determination. Each classroom and community meeting carried hope intertwined with struggle. The pursuit of knowledge and civic participation demanded courage in a society still fractured by prejudice and mistrust. In witnessing these efforts, we see that the legacy of the Civil War lives not only in memory, but in the tangible work of building a fairer, more conscious society. Across the South, towns and farms slowly rose from ruins. Workers repaired buildings, cleared fields, and restored basic services, carrying both tools and hope. What feels striking is how Reconstruction demanded patience and resilience, showing that rebuilding a nation requires attention not only to structures, but to the spirit of its people. Each beam lifted and street cleared represented more than labor. It symbolized determination to reclaim stability and community. The war's physical scars mirrored social and emotional wounds, reminding us that recovery is a continuous process where progress intertwines with memory, responsibility, and collective endurance. Years after the war, Union and Confederate veterans gathered, sharing memories of battle, loss, and survival. What feels most profound is how camaraderie and reflection transcended former divisions. These reunions were not only about remembering the past, but also about shaping a collective understanding of sacrifice, resilience, and the cost of unity. Veterans' conversations carried both pride and sorrow. They grappled with the meaning of victory and defeat, the lives lost, and the lessons learned. In their shared remembrance, the war's legacy became humanized, reminding us that history is preserved not only in documents, but in the lived experience of those who endured it. America paused to reflect on the Civil War's legacy, confronting both the triumph of preserved unity and the lingering wounds of division. What feels most powerful is how collective memory became a tool for understanding responsibility, teaching that freedom and justice are achieved not only through victory, but through reflection, reconciliation, and ensuring vigilance. This reflection extended beyond politics into culture, education, and civic life. Citizens considered the moral, social, and human lessons of the war, recognizing that the struggle's impact reached far beyond battlefields. In this way, the Civil War's legacy endured, guiding future generations toward unity grounded in conscience and remembrance. The Civil War reshaped a nation, leaving lessons etched in sacrifice, courage, and unity. Every story we explored shows how choices ripple through history. Take a moment to reflect on the human impact and enduring principles that emerged. If you value understanding the past and its meaning today, subscribe to the Inside Vault and join us in uncovering history's truths. Looking back at these defining moments, we see the courage, struggle, and resilience that built a nation. History teaches us about responsibility, empathy, and foresight. By following the Inside Vault, you can continue this journey, exploring stories that illuminate humanity's past and inspire thoughtful reflection for the present. Abraham Lincoln stands as a reminder that leadership carries both moral and human weight. His choices shaped a nation and continue to inspire reflection on justice and courage. If you want to explore these moments in depth and witness how history connects to our lives today, subscribe to the Inside Vault and be part of this journey through time. Lincoln's vision reminds us that decisions define more than policies, they shape people, communities, and legacies. By following the Inside Vault, you can see history through the lens of human experience, understanding not just events, but the lives they touched, the lessons they left, and the inspiration they offer for the future. History is alive, and every story carries insight for today. Join the Inside Vault to explore moments that shaped humanity, uncover lessons of courage, sacrifice, and change. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and be part of a community that values learning from the past to inspire the future. The past connects us all, revealing how choices, struggles, and triumphs define our world. By subscribing to the Inside Vault, you can continue this journey, discovering compelling stories and understanding their relevance to our lives. Engage, reflect, and let history guide your curiosity. Start exploring with us today.